Every container stacked on every ship, loaded onto every train, carried by every truck on every highway in the world, they are all almost exactly the same size. Who decided that and why that size? The answer is not a committee of engineers who sat down and worked out the perfect dimensions. It is the story of one stubborn truck driver from North Carolina, a bitter war between railroads and shipping companies, and a number 20 feet that almost never happened at all. To understand what the container solved, you have to understand what moving cargo looked like before it existed. In 1950, if you wanted to ship a crate of machine parts from a factory in Pittsburgh to a buyer in Hamburg, your goods would be handled, physically touched, moved, or stacked somewhere between 15 and 20 separate times before they arrived. Longshoremen would unload a truck piece by piece onto a dock. Another crew would carry each piece into a ship's hold and stack it by hand. At the other end, the whole process reversed. A ship might spend more time sitting in port being loaded and unloaded than it spent actually crossing the ocean. Labor costs ate somewhere between 60 and 70 cents of every dollar spent on freight. The cargo itself, exposed, handled endlessly, passed between dozens of hands, was perpetually at risk. Theft was endemic. Breakage was routine. There was no system. There was just an accumulation of 100 years of habits that nobody had seriously questioned because nobody had found a way to do it differently. That is the world Malcolm McLean inherited when he started driving a truck in 1934 in Maxton, North Carolina. He was 21 years old, hauling cotton and tobacco across the South, and he was very good at it. By the early 1950s, he owned a trucking company, McLean Trucking, that was one of the largest in the United States. And he had a problem. His trucks sat in port traffic for hours, sometimes days, waiting while his freight was offloaded by hand. He was paying his drivers to sit still. Somewhere in those hours of waiting, he had an idea that was almost too obvious to take seriously. What if you didn't unload the cargo at all? What if you just took the whole truck trailer, lifted it onto the ship, and dropped it off at the other end? The box itself becomes the ship's cargo unit. You never touch the goods inside. McLean eventually sold his trucking company, which federal law required him to do before he could own a shipping line, and in 1955 he bought a small tanker company called Pan Atlantic Steamship. His plan was not to invent a new box. His plan was to put truck trailers on ships. But when his engineers started working through the practical details, a problem emerged immediately. Truck trailers have wheels. Wheels take up space. A ship loaded with trailers is mostly carrying dead weight, axles, and tires that contribute nothing to revenue. Keith Tantlinger, McLean's chief engineer, proposed stripping the wheels off entirely, just the box. A steel box with standardized corner fittings, stackable, transferable to a truck chassis or a flat car at the destination. On April 26, 1956, a converted tanker called the Idealex left the port of Newark carrying 58 of these stripped aluminum containers on its deck, bound for Houston. The cost of loading that cargo had been reduced from $5.83 per ton, the industry average, to 15.8 cents per ton. That number is not a typo. The savings were so dramatic they barely seemed credible, but here is where the story bends. McLean had a box. He did not yet have a standard. His containers were 33 feet long, chosen because that matched a common truck trailer length. The railroads, who should have been his natural partners in a door-to-door system, were hostile. They saw containerization as a threat to their own freight business and initially refused to cooperate on dimensions, handling equipment, or cross-system transfers. Other shipping companies began developing their own containers in the late 1950s. Grace Line had a 17-foot container. Matson Navigation was using 24-foot boxes for its Hawaii routes. The U.S. military was experimenting with its own sizes for logistics. By 1960, there were at least a dozen competing container sizes in use across the industry, and every port that wanted to handle containers had to choose or buy equipment for all of them. The system was fracturing before it had a chance to unify. The lock-in moment came not from the market, but from a committee, specifically from the ISO, the International Organization for Standardization, which began studying container dimensions in 1961. The process was slow, contentious, and almost derailed twice. The United States pushed hard for 10-foot module containers that could be 10, 20, or 40 feet long, with the 20-foot unit as the base. The Europeans, who had been building their own systems around different dimensions, pushed back. The British favored an 8-foot by 8-foot cross-section but argued over lengths. The Soviets, who were beginning to build their own container network, had different preferences entirely. What broke the deadlock was not compromise on the most logical dimensions. It was compromise on the dimensions that caused the least disruption to what McLean's company, Sealand, had already built. By 1964, Sealand had spent tens of millions of dollars building cranes, port infrastructure, and chassis systems around the 20-foot unit. Changing the base size would have meant writing off that investment. In 1966, the ISO formally adopted the 20-foot and 40-foot containers as the international standard, with a cross-section of 8 feet wide by 8 feet 6 inches tall. The 20-foot equivalent unit, TEU, became the basic vocabulary of global trade. Every port capacity figure, every shipping rate, every trade statistic you read today is still denominated in TEUs. That unit, that abbreviation, traces directly to the infrastructure Sealand had already committed to in 1956. The rival that came closest to winning was Matson Navigation's 24-foot container, and it lost for a reason that had almost nothing to do with engineering. Matson was operating the Hawaii trade route, a closed domestic loop that didn't require international compatibility. Their 24-foot box was, by several accounts, a better fit for the cargo volumes that most shippers actually sent. It sat at a sweet spot between the 20-foot unit, which many shippers felt was slightly too small for efficient loading, and the 40-foot unit, which was too large for smaller consignments. Matson's system was well-run, profitable, and technically sound, but it was self-contained. Because the Hawaii route didn't cross international borders, Matson had no seat at the ISO table in the early 1960s. They were not part of the negotiation. When the standard was set, it was set around the infrastructure that Sealand had built for transatlantic and transpacific routes, the routes that actually needed international compatibility. The 24-foot container didn't lose because it was worse. It lost because the fight was happening in a room Matson wasn't in. The 20-foot standard won because it was already in the ground. Today, roughly 800 million TEU equivalents move through the world's ports every year. The corner castings on a container, those thick steel fittings at each of the 8 corners, have not changed in any fundamental way since Keith Tantlinger's original 1955 design. There is a direct mechanical line between the box he sketched in McLean's office and the container that just moved the sneakers in your closet, or the phone in your pocket, or the coffee in your kitchen. But here is the thing that recontextualizes everything. That 20-foot standard was not an answer to the question of what size a container should be. It was an answer to the question of what size Sealand had already built its cranes for. The global infrastructure of trade, the ports, the ships, the trains, the trucks, all scaled itself around a number that was chosen in significant part because one trucking company from North Carolina had committed to it before anyone else had made a decision. The next time you see a container on a flatbed truck moving down the highway, you're looking at the physical echo of a converted tanker that left Newark on a Tuesday morning in 1956. The dimensions were locked in before the standard was written. The standard was written to match the dimensions, and somewhere in that circularity is the actual story of how the modern world gets built.